An elderly black man walks into a luxurious store, treated with cold stares and outright disrespect, dismissed because of his age and appearance. But when they demand he leave, he quietly drops a bombshell. He owns the very building they're standing in, and half the city beyond it. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stick around for the story of justice, humility, and a shocking twist that no one saw coming. Don't miss stories like this. Subscribe now and join us for more powerful and inspiring tales. The soft morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Earl's modest living room, casting delicate patterns onto the faded wooden floor. Earl sat in his favorite chair, a well-worn recliner that groaned slightly as he leaned back. In his hands, he held a polished silver watch, its face worn with time but lovingly cared for. It wasn't just a watch. It was a piece of history, a gift from his late wife, Margaret, on the day they opened their first small grocery store. Earl ran his thumb over the engraving on the back. Together. Always. His eyes lingered on the inscription as a small smile tugged at his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a smile weighted with memories, some joyous, some bittersweet. Margaret had been gone 10 years now, but her presence lingered in the house. Every corner held a trace of her favorite vase on the mantel, the crocheted blanket draped over the couch, the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her pillow. Earl let out a soft sigh and slipped the watch into his pocket. Today wasn't a day for dwelling on the past, he told himself. He had errands to run, and there was no time to waste. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Earl straightened his back and adjusted his cardigan before shuffling to answer. On the other side stood Jamal, a bright-eyed young man in his early 20s with a wide grin and a hint of mischief in his gaze. Jamal had been stopping by regularly since Earl took him under his wing. He was a promising kid, full of energy but still rough around the edges, eager to learn from Earl's quiet wisdom. "Morning, Mr. Earl," Jamal said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He carried a steaming cup of coffee, which he placed carefully on the small table by the door. "Thought you might need a little pick-me-up." Earl chuckled softly. "You think I can't make my own coffee?" "Not like this," Jamal teased. "Special blend, costs almost $10 a cup. Figured you ought to try it at least once." Earl raised an eyebrow but took a sip anyway. The rich, bold flavor hit his tongue, and he nodded approvingly. "Well, I'll be. Guess you got good taste after all." Jamal beamed as he plopped onto the couch, making himself at home. "So, what's on the agenda today? Gonna show me how you built this whole city?" Earl shook his head, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "Not today. Got some errands to run. Thinking about picking up something special." Jamal's curiosity piqued. "Special, huh? Like what?" Earl didn't answer right away. He walked over to the window and gazed out at the street below, where kids played tag on the sidewalk, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "Something for Margaret," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "It's been a while since I've done anything to honor her." Jamal nodded, the teasing edge in his voice replaced with quiet respect. "She'd like that. You need me to come with you?" Earl shook his head. "I can handle it. Besides, some lessons you gotta learn on your own. You just keep working on those plans we talked about." Jamal sat up straighter, his enthusiasm returning. "You mean the community center?" Earl nodded. "You've got the ideas. Now you need to figure out how to bring them to life. That's the hard part, making people believe it's worth their time and money." Jamal leaned back, his brow furrowed in thought. Earl watched him for a moment, seeing a bit of himself in the young man's determination. He reached out and patted Jamal's shoulder. "You'll get there, son. Just remember, it's not about proving people wrong. It's about proving yourself right." With that, Earl grabbed his hat from the stand and stepped out into the crisp morning air. He had a plan for the day, though he hadn't shared all the details with Jamal. There was a shop downtown he had been eyeing for weeks, one he had been putting off visiting. It was time to stop delaying. Today was about more than a purchase. It was about remembering Margaret, about honoring their journey together. As he walked down the quiet street, Earl straightened his shoulders and quickened his pace. He wasn't just an old man running errands. He was a man on a mission, though few would have guessed it from his simple demeanor. And while he couldn't know what lay ahead, there was a calm determination in his step, as if he was ready for anything the day might throw his way. Earl stepped off the bus in the heart of downtown, a bustling district where sleek skyscrapers loomed over cobblestone streets. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and exhaust, mingling with the faint strains of street musicians playing nearby. Earl adjusted his hat, tucking it firmly atop his head, and began walking with purpose. The shop he had in mind wasn't far, a high-end boutique nestled between a luxury jewelry store and an exclusive art gallery. As he approached, Earl couldn't help but notice the people around him. Young professionals in tailored suits hurried past, their heads buried in their phones. Tourists milled about, snapping photos of the historic architecture while trying not to stumble on the uneven stones beneath their feet. Earl's plain cardigan and scuffed shoes set him apart, though he didn't seem to mind. He had spent a lifetime learning to ignore the assumptions people made about him. The boutique came into view, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the bright sunlight. Earl paused briefly to take in the sight. He'd read about this place in the paper, a new shop boasting rare, handcrafted goods from around the world. It was exactly the kind of place Margaret would have loved, and he imagined her excitement as she browsed the displays, admiring the intricate designs. Steeling himself, Earl pushed open the heavy glass door. A chime rang out crisp and clear, announcing his arrival. Inside, the boutique was even more luxurious than he'd expected. Soft lighting illuminated elegant displays of jewelry, leather goods, and art pieces. The air was lightly perfumed with something floral and expensive, and classical music played softly in the background. Earl stood for a moment, taking it all in. It wasn't often he found himself in places like this anymore. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a delicate gold bracelet in a nearby case. It was simple but elegant, much like Margaret herself. He stepped forward to get a closer look, but before he could reach the case, a voice stopped him. "May I help you, sir?" The tone wasn't warm. It was clipped and hesitant, like someone bracing for inconvenience. Earl turned to see a young woman standing behind the counter. Her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate makeup suggested she belonged in this world of wealth and refinement, but the faint furrow in her brow betrayed her uncertainty. Earl offered her a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for something special. A gift." The woman's eyes flicked over him, taking in his cardigan, his worn shoes, and the gentle stoop in his shoulders. Her expression shifted slightly, and her lips tightened into a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, our pieces are very exclusive. Perhaps you'd like to start with something simpler?" Earl didn't flinch at the implied insult, though he felt a pang of irritation. Instead, he pointed to the gold bracelet. "That one caught my eye. Could I take a closer look?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the back of the store where a manager stood, talking animatedly with another customer. She seemed to weigh her options before replying. "Of course. Just a moment." She retrieved the bracelet and placed it on the counter in front of him, her movements brisk and perfunctory. Earl examined it closely, appreciating the fine craftsmanship. Margaret would have loved it, he thought again. "May I ask the price?" he said, keeping his tone neutral. The woman hesitated again before answering, her voice slightly higher than before. "It's $6,000. Earl raised his eyebrows slightly but didn't react otherwise. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "It's beautiful. I think she would have liked it." The woman's brow furrowed deeper, as though she wasn't quite sure what to make of him. "Would you like me to hold it for you?" she asked, her tone edging toward condescension. Earl looked up, meeting her gaze evenly. "No, thank you. I'll take it today." The woman's expression froze for a moment before she quickly recovered, her professional mask snapping back into place. "I'll need to check with the manager," she said, her tone carefully measured. As she walked away, Earl caught sight of another employee watching the interaction from a distance. The young man's face was a mix of curiosity and discomfort, as though he understood what was unfolding but wasn't sure how to intervene. Earl met his gaze briefly and gave him a small, reassuring nod. He'd seen this kind of thing before, people underestimating him, dismissing him. It wasn't new, and it didn't surprise him. But today, he thought, things might play out a little differently. Earl stood there calmly, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. The faint strains of classical music continued to fill the air, but underneath it, a tension had begun to brew. The woman returned a moment later, this time accompanied by the manager, a tall man with a sharp suit and a sharper gaze. Earl could feel the shift in the atmosphere as they approached, and he prepared himself for what he knew was coming next. The manager approached with measured strides, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His expression was the epitome of polite authority, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even suspicion. Earl remained where he was, standing tall despite his slight frame, his hands still clasped behind his back. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager began, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I understand you're interested in this piece." Earl nodded, his gaze steady. "That's right, I'd like to purchase it." The manager glanced at the saleswoman, who stood slightly behind him, her face carefully neutral. Then he turned his attention back to Earl, his professional demeanor softening into something just shy of patronizing. "This is one of our more exclusive items," he said, as if testing the waters. "Are you certain you're ready to proceed?" Earl's expression didn't change, but there was a faint edge to his voice as he replied, "I'm certain." The manager hesitated, clearly weighing his next move. Earl could see the wheels turning in the man's mind. This wasn't about the bracelet anymore. It was about appearances, about assumptions, about power dynamics. The manager gestured toward the side of the room, where a small seating area with plush chairs and a glass coffee table had been arranged for consultations. "Why don't we step over here?" the manager suggested. "We can discuss payment options in detail." Earl didn't move right away. For a moment, he considered walking out, leaving them to stew in their ignorance. But something stopped him, a quiet resolve, born from decades of facing moments like this and choosing to rise above them. Slowly, he nodded and followed the manager to the seating area. They settled into chairs, the manager leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. Earl remained upright, his back straight, his expression calm. "I assume you're aware," the manager began, "that this bracelet is priced at $6,000. We typically require a deposit before processing a sale of this magnitude." Earl's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "Is that so? Do you require deposits from all your customers, or just the ones who look like me?" The manager blinked, caught off guard. He recovered quickly, his polished mask slipping back into place, but there was a faint tension in his jaw now. "Of course not, sir," he said smoothly. "We have standard protocols for high-value transactions. I'm simply trying to ensure a seamless experience for you." Earl nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the manager's face. "I appreciate your concern for my experience. Let's make it seamless then. I'll pay the full amount right now." The room fell silent for a moment, the classical music playing faintly in the background. The manager hesitated, clearly unprepared for this response. "Very well," he said at last, his tone clipped. "I'll have the sales associate prepare the paperwork." As the manager stood and walked away, Earl leaned back slightly in his chair, letting out a quiet breath. His patience was being tested, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He'd seen this act play out before, people measuring his worth by the cut of his clothes or the color of his skin. But Earl had learned long ago that true power wasn't in appearances. It was in action, in choices, in the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you were. The young man who had been watching earlier approached cautiously, holding a small tablet for processing the payment. He seemed nervous, his hands fumbling slightly as he set the device on the table in front of Earl. "I'm sorry about the wait, sir," the young man said, his voice low. I'll just need you to sign here." Earl glanced up at him, noting the genuine apology in his tone. "What's your name, son?" he asked. The young man hesitated, then said, "Marcus." Earl nodded. "Thank you, Marcus. You're doing just fine." Marcus managed a small smile, and Earl took the stylus, signing his name with a steady hand. The payment went through without issue, and Marcus handed him the bracelet, now carefully placed in a velvet-lined box. "Thank you for your business," Marcus said, his sincerity a stark contrast to the cold professionalism of the others. Earl stood and placed the box into his pocket. "You'll do well here, Marcus," he said, giving the young man a nod before turning back toward the exit. As he walked past the manager and saleswoman, he paused just long enough to meet their eyes. "Good day," he said simply, his tone polite but firm, before stepping out into the bright sunlight once more. The door closed behind him, the chime ringing out like a final note of triumph. Earl adjusted his hat and started down the sidewalk, his steps steady, his resolve unshaken. Today, he thought, was just the beginning. Earl walked down the bustling street, the velvet-lined box weighing lightly in his pocket, though the weight of the encounter still lingered. The sunlight seemed sharper now, the air carrying an edge of cold despite the warmth of the day. He wasn't angry. No, anger was something he had learned to temper long ago. But there was a simmering resolve in his chest, a reminder of why he had fought so hard to build his legacy. As he crossed the street, the sound of children's laughter caught his ear. He glanced over to see a group of kids playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, outside a row of small shops. One of the shops, an old-fashioned candy store, was a place he and Margaret used to visit when they first started out. The storefront had changed over the years, but the memories it held hadn't. Earl paused for a moment, letting the nostalgia wash over him, before continuing on his way. His next destination was a small diner on the corner, a community staple he had frequented for decades. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the warm, familiar scent of coffee and grilled sandwiches greeted him. A few heads turned as he entered, and he was met with friendly smiles and nods from the regulars. "Earl," called a voice from behind the counter. It was Clara, the diner's owner, a stout woman with a booming laugh and a heart of gold. She wiped her hands on her apron and waved him over. "Haven't seen you in a couple of days. How's life treating you?" Earl smiled, his first genuine smile of the day. "Good to see you, Clara. Life's treating me fine. Just needed a little air." Clara poured him a cup of coffee without asking, setting it on the counter in front of him. "Air, huh? You look like you've had one of those mornings. Want to talk about it?" Earl chuckled softly, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and hot, just the way he liked it. "Not much to talk about, just ran into some folks who forgot their manners, that's all." Clara leaned on the counter, narrowing her eyes. "Uh-huh. Sounds like there's more to that story. You know you can't fool me, Earl." He shook his head, still smiling. "Nothing worth worrying about, I handled it." Clara studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "I'm sure you did. You've got a way of reminding people who's in charge without saying much." She grinned, her eyes twinkling. "But if you ever need me to knock some sense into someone, you just let me know." Earl laughed, a deep, rich sound that drew a few amused glances from the other patrons. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, tipping his hat slightly. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, he couldn't help but reflect on how different the diner was from the boutique he'd just left. Here, no one cared about his clothes or his age or his demeanor. Here, he was just Earl, a man who had earned his place in the fabric of the community. The bell over the door jingled again, and Earl glanced up to see a younger man entering, his shoulders slouched and his eyes downcast. Earl recognized him immediately, Tyrone, a young father struggling to make ends meet. Tyrone had recently lost his job and had been coming to the diner often, looking for odd jobs and a kind word from Clara. Earl had been keeping an eye on him, quietly helping out where he could. Tyrone spotted Earl and hesitated before approaching. "Morning, Mr. Earl," he said quietly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Morning, Tyrone," Earl replied, gesturing to the stool next to him. "What brings you in?" Tyrone sat down, fidgeting slightly. "Just trying to figure things out," he said, his voice heavy. "It's been a rough couple of weeks." Earl nodded slowly, letting the young man speak at his own pace. He knew that sometimes people just needed someone to listen. "You ever feel like no matter what you do, people only see what they want to see?" Tyrone asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Earl met his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "More times than I can count," he said. "But here's the thing. You can't control what they see. All you can do is decide what you're going to show them." Tyrone frowned, thinking this over. What if they still don't get it? What if it doesn't change anything? Earl placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then you keep going. You don't change for them. You change for yourself, for your family, for the ones who matter. That's how you win." Tyrone nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thanks, Mr. Earl. I needed that." "Anytime, son," Earl said, giving him a small pat on the back. As Tyrone got up to leave, Clara returned with a fresh pot of coffee. She poured Earl another cup, her expression softening as she watched Tyrone walk out the door. "You're always helping folks, Earl," she said quietly. "Don't think I don't notice." Earl smiled but didn't say anything. He simply sipped his coffee, his mind already moving ahead to what the rest of the day might hold. The city was alive with opportunities, and Earl knew better than anyone how to seize them. Today was far from over, and there were still lessons to be taught. Earl finished his coffee, setting the cup down gently as he rose from his seat. The warmth of Clara's smile and the simple honesty of the diner lingered with him as he stepped back into the busy street. The city's rhythm seemed to pulse louder now, the sounds of car horns and footsteps weaving into a chaotic symphony that Earl knew all too well. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the velvet box. Margaret's bracelet was secure, but his thoughts weren't on the jewelry anymore. The memory of the boutique clung to him like a shadow, not because it was unexpected. He'd faced enough prejudice in his life to expect it, but because of the subtle pain it carried. It was a reminder that no matter how far he had come, the world still had its corners of ignorance and judgment. Earl wasn't one to brood, though. He believed in action, in shaping outcomes rather than dwelling on injustices. And today, action meant visiting one of his most significant investments. As he walked toward the bus stop, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Earl paused, slipping it out to see a familiar name on the screen. Denise Parker. She was the lawyer who handled many of his business affairs, and one of the few people who knew the full extent of his holdings. "Good afternoon, Denise," Earl said, his tone steady. "Good afternoon, Mr. Earl," Denise replied, her voice brisk but polite. "I just wanted to confirm your meeting later today at the Community Redevelopment Office. They've finalized the plans for the housing project, and your approval is the last step." Earl nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I'll be there. Anything else I should know?" "There's been some pushback from a few investors," Denise said carefully. "They're questioning the profitability of allocating so much space for affordable housing." Earl's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Tell them my decision stands. This city doesn't need more penthouses, it needs homes for families." Denise hesitated briefly before responding. "Understood. I'll make sure everything is ready for your signature." "Thank you, Denise," Earl said, ending the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued toward the bus stop, his mind already shifting to the upcoming meeting. The redevelopment project was one of his proudest achievements, a chance to transform neglected areas of the city into vibrant, inclusive neighborhoods. It was also deeply personal. Decades ago, Earl and Margaret had lived in one of those same neighborhoods, struggling to make ends meet while dreaming of a better future. Now, Earl had the means to ensure that other families didn't have to struggle the way they had. The bus arrived with a loud hiss, and Earl climbed aboard, tipping his hat to the driver. The ride to the Community Redevelopment Office took him through a mix of neighborhoods, some thriving, others still clinging to life despite the odds. Earl watched the city pass by through the window, his thoughts drifting between past and present. When he arrived at the office, he was greeted by a young receptionist who seemed eager to impress. "Mr. Earl, it's an honor to have you here," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly as she led him to the conference room. The room was bright and modern, with large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. Around the table sat a mix of officials, developers, and investors, their conversations pausing as Earl entered. Some smiled warmly, others exchanged uncertain glances. Earl could feel the undercurrent of tension, the unspoken questions about his priorities and methods. He took his seat at the head of the table, his presence commanding without being overt. One of the investors, a sharp-suited man named Gregory Walsh, leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Earl, before we proceed, I'd like to revisit the allocation percentages. While I understand the intention behind the affordable housing units, I believe we're underestimating the potential revenue from—" Earl held up a hand, silencing him with a calm but firm gesture. "Gregory," he said, his voice measured, "this isn't just about revenue. It's about creating a city where everyone has a chance to thrive. If we can't make that a priority, then what's the point?" The room fell silent, the weight of Earl's words settling over the table. Gregory shifted uncomfortably but said nothing further. Earl's gaze swept across the room, meeting each person's eyes with quiet authority. "This project isn't just an investment for me," Earl continued. "It's a promise to the families who've been forgotten, to the kids who deserve safe places to grow up, and to the neighborhoods that have been left behind. If any of you have a problem with that, you're free to walk away." No one moved. Earl nodded, satisfied. The discussion turned to logistics, and the meeting progressed smoothly from there. By the time he signed the final documents, there was a sense of resolve in the room, a recognition of Earl's vision and the power behind it. As he left the office, Earl felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew the work was far from over, but every step forward was a victory. He paused at the edge of the street, looking out over the city he had helped shape. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was his. And today, it felt just a little closer to the dream he and Margaret had shared all those years ago. Earl walked down the street with a quiet sense of accomplishment, the weight of the meeting lifting slightly from his shoulders. His steps were deliberate, his mind replaying the conversation at the redevelopment office. While the investors' hesitance had been expected, it was a reminder that progress was never as straightforward as he hoped. Still, the project was moving forward, and that was what mattered most. As he approached a familiar intersection, Earl noticed a small crowd gathered outside a boarded-up building. The structure, once a vibrant community center, now stood in disrepair, its windows shattered and its walls tagged with graffiti. A group of teenagers stood off to the side, their voices loud and animated as they argued over a makeshift basketball hoop they'd rigged to a lamppost. In the middle of the crowd was a woman with a clipboard, her fiery red hair and no-nonsense demeanor making her stand out. Earl recognized her immediately, Sandra, one of the community leaders he'd worked with on several initiatives. She was gesturing emphatically as she spoke to a city official in a crisp navy suit. Earl approached quietly, his presence going unnoticed at first. Sandra's voice carried over the hum of the crowd. "We've been waiting for months, and nothing's changed. This center used to be the heart of our community, and now look at it. How much longer are we supposed to wait for your approval?" The city official adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable under Sandra's scrutiny. "We're reviewing the budget allocations," he said stiffly. "These things take time." Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but Earl stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Time's a luxury these kids don't have." The crowd turned as one, and Sandra's expression shifted from frustration to relief when she saw Earl. "Mr. Earl," she said, her tone softening. "I didn't know you were back in this part of town." Earl nodded, his gaze fixed on the city official. "Sandra's right. This community has waited long enough. What's the holdup?" The official hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Earl's presence. "It's not a simple matter," he stammered. There are budgetary concerns, logistical challenges. Let me make it simple for you, Earl interrupted, his voice calm but firm. What's the price tag? The official blinked. Excuse me? You heard me, Earl said, his tone unwavering. What's the cost to get this center up and running again? The official hesitated, pulling out a tablet to consult a series of spreadsheets. Sandra leaned in, her arms crossed, as the crowd watched with bated breath. Finally, the official looked up. Based on preliminary estimates, we'd need at least $200,000 to cover repairs and staffing. Earl nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad, scribbling something quickly before tearing off the page. He handed it to the official. There's your $200,000, Earl said. Consider it a donation. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, and Sandra's eyes widened. Mr. Earl, are you serious? Earl turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. This place gave me and Margaret a lot when we were starting out. Time to give back. The official stared at the check, his face a mix of astonishment and gratitude. I don't know what to say. Say you'll make it happen, Earl replied, and don't take your time. Sandra stepped forward, her voice breaking slightly as she said, You don't know what this means to us, to them. She gestured toward the teenagers, who had stopped playing and were now watching with wide eyes. Earl glanced over at the kids, his expression softening. I know exactly what it means, he said quietly. And it's worth every penny. The crowd erupted into applause, and a few people stepped forward to shake Earl's hand. He accepted their gratitude with quiet humility, nodding and offering a few words of encouragement. Sandra promised to keep him updated on the progress, and Earl could see the determination in her eyes as she turned back to the city official, ready to hold him accountable. As Earl walked away, the sounds of renewed energy filled the air. The crowd was buzzing with hope, and the teenagers had resumed their game, their laughter ringing out like music. Earl felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the community center would soon be more than just a memory. He continued down the street, his pace unhurried. The city stretched out before him, alive with possibilities. There was still much to be done, and Earl knew that his work was far from over. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to savor the small victories, knowing that each step forward brought him closer to the legacy he and Margaret had always envisioned. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the city as Earl walked back toward the bus stop. His movements were steady, but there was a quiet energy in his steps, a momentum fueled by the events of the day. The crowd at the community center had reminded him why he fought so hard to build what he had. It wasn't just for himself or for Margaret's memory. It was for the countless others who needed someone to believe in them, to pave the way for their dreams. As Earl waited at the bus stop, the hum of the city around him, his phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket and saw Jamal's name flashing on the screen. Smiling faintly, he answered, "What's on your mind, son?" Jamal's voice came through, brimming with excitement. "Mr. Earl, you won't believe it. I just got off the phone with the director of the youth program. They loved my pitch for the community center expansion. They want to meet with me next week to discuss funding." Earl chuckled softly. "That's good news, Jamal. You're making moves already." "I couldn't have done it without your guidance," Jamal said, his tone more serious now. "You've been teaching me so much, not just about business, but about doing it the right way." Earl leaned against the bus stop pole, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "You've got the drive, Jamal. That's what matters most. The rest is just details." There was a pause on the other end, and then Jamal asked, "How was your day, Mr. Earl? Did you find what you were looking for?" Earl glanced down at his pocket where the velvet box rested. "I did," he said simply, "and then some." Before Jamal could ask more, the bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. Earl said his goodbyes and boarded, taking a seat near the back. The ride home was quieter now, the evening rush beginning to fade. Earl leaned back, his thoughts drifting as the bus wound its way through familiar streets. When he finally arrived at his stop, the neighborhood was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Earl stepped off the bus and began the short walk to his house. The quiet of the evening was a stark contrast to the bustling energy of downtown, and Earl found it soothing. He passed by neighbors he'd known for years, exchanging nods and smiles. Here, he wasn't a businessman or a philanthropist. He was just Earl, the man who always had a kind word and a story to share. As he approached his front steps, Earl paused. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the small, neat yard. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking it all in. This house, this neighborhood, this life. It was all part of the foundation he and Margaret had built together. Every brick, every blade of grass held a story. Earl stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The house was quiet, but it was a comforting kind of quiet, filled with the echoes of a life well lived. He made his way to the living room and sat in his favorite chair, pulling the velvet box from his pocket. He opened it slowly, the delicate gold bracelet catching the light. Margaret would have loved it, he thought. She'd always had an eye for simple elegance, and this piece felt like her, a reminder of the woman who had been his partner in every sense of the word. Earl sat there for a long moment, the bracelet resting in his palm, as memories of their life together filled his mind. Finally, he stood and walked to the small shelf where a picture of Margaret sat in a silver frame. It was one of his favorite photos of her, taken on the day they'd opened their first store. She was laughing, her eyes bright with excitement and determination. Earl placed the bracelet gently next to the photo, a tribute to her spirit and the life they had built together. As he stepped back, Earl felt a sense of peace settle over him. The day had been long, but it had been meaningful. He had faced challenges, helped his community, and honored the woman who had always been his guiding light. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new opportunities, and new lessons. But for now, Earl allowed himself to simply be. The morning light crept into the living room as Earl sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The house was still, the kind of stillness that came with the early hours before the world fully woke up. Earl didn't mind the quiet. It gave him time to think, to plan. His mind wandered to the community center, the redevelopment project, and the faint but persistent tug of unfinished business. Earl glanced toward the shelf where Margaret's bracelet now rested beside her photo. The sight brought a faint smile to his face, but it was fleeting. He had accomplished much yesterday, but there was always more to do. The phone on the table buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a name he hadn't expected. Joseph Campbell. Earl hesitated for a moment before answering. Joseph was a high-profile developer who had often found himself at odds with Earl over community-focused projects. Their visions for the city couldn't have been more different. Joseph saw profit margins while Earl saw people. "Joseph," Earl said, his tone even. "This is a surprise." "Good morning, Earl," Joseph replied, his voice smooth and calculated. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all," Earl said, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Joseph said, "I wanted to discuss the redevelopment project. I understand you made quite the statement at the meeting yesterday." Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. "I made my priorities clear. If that's a problem for you, I suggest you reconsider your position." Joseph chuckled lightly, though there was no humor in it. "Always the moral compass, aren't you? Look, Earl, I understand your passion, but this city is growing. We can't build a future on charity alone." Earl's jaw tightened. "It's not charity, Joseph. It's investment. Investment in people, in neighborhoods, in the kind of future where everyone has a chance." Joseph sighed, his tone shifting to something more conciliatory. "I respect what you're trying to do, but you're making it difficult for the rest of us. These investors aren't going to stick around if they don't see returns." Earl stood, moving to the window as he looked out over the quiet street. "Then let them leave. I've built this city without their help before, and I'll do it again if I have to." There was silence on the other end, and Earl could almost picture Joseph's calculating expression. Finally, Joseph said, "You're a stubborn man, Earl. But I can't say I didn't expect this. I just hope you're prepared for the consequences." Earl's voice was steady as he replied, "I've been facing consequences my whole life, Joseph. This won't be any different." He ended the call and set the phone down on the counter, his thoughts swirling. Joseph's thinly veiled threat wasn't new, but it was a reminder of the constant push and pull between progress and profit. Earl took a deep breath, letting the tension roll off his shoulders. He had faced bigger challenges before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The day stretched ahead of him, full of potential and uncertainty. Earl poured himself another cup of coffee and sat back down at the table. He had calls to make, plans to refine, and people to rally. The work wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Earl had always believed that real change started with small, deliberate actions, and today would be no exception. Earl set down his coffee cup and reached for the small leather notebook he kept on the table, a habit he'd maintained for decades. Inside, the pages were filled with meticulous notes, ideas for projects, reminders about people to call, and small scribbles of inspiration. Flipping through, he paused on a page marked with Margaret's handwriting. It was a list of their shared dreams for the city, written years ago, when they were young and full of hope. Many of the items had been crossed off, but some still remained. Earl traced the words with his finger, a silent promise forming in his mind to see them through. He closed the notebook, slipping it into his pocket as he grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. Today's agenda would be packed, starting with a visit to one of his properties on the edge of the city. It was a neglected apartment complex that Earl had recently acquired, a place he hoped to turn into affordable housing. But first, he wanted to meet the people who lived there, to hear their stories and understand their needs before making decisions from an office chair. The bus ride was longer this time, winding through parts of the city that had seen better days. Earl's sharp eyes took in the details, the cracked sidewalks, the boarded-up shops, the faded signs that once advertised thriving businesses. It wasn't just blight. It was a story of resilience, of people holding on despite the odds. When the bus pulled to a stop in front of the complex, Earl stepped off and adjusted his hat. The building was worn, its paint peeling and windows smudged, but it stood tall, a testament to the people who called it home. Children played on the stoop, their laughter carrying through the air, while a few adults sat on folding chairs, their faces weary but watchful. Earl approached one of the women, a young mother with a toddler perched on her lap. She looked up, startled at first, but relaxed as Earl offered a warm smile. "Morning, ma'am," Earl said, tipping his hat slightly. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" The woman hesitated before nodding. "Sure, I guess." Earl sat on the edge of the stoop, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He introduced himself simply, not as a wealthy man or a property owner, but as someone who wanted to understand. "This building," Earl said after a moment, "it's been through a lot, hasn't it?" The woman let out a short laugh, tinged with bitterness. "You could say that. Leaks, broken heat, garbage piling up. The landlord doesn't care. None of them ever do." Earl nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here. I'm the new owner, and I want to change that." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she shifted the toddler on her lap. "You're the new owner? Why would someone like you care about a place like this?" Earl met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because places like this matter. Because the people who live here matter." For a moment the woman said nothing. Then she nodded, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "Well, if you really mean that, you've got your work cut out for you." Earl smiled. "I'm not afraid of work." As the conversation continued, more residents began to gather, drawn by the sight of Earl sitting on the stoop like one of their own. They shared their frustrations, their fears, and their dreams for what the complex could become. Earl listened carefully, taking notes in his small notebook, his respect for their resilience growing with every story. By the time he left, the sun was high in the sky, and the mood among the residents had shifted. There was a cautious optimism in the air, a sense that perhaps this time things would be different. Earl walked back to the bus stop, his mind racing with plans for repairs, upgrades, and community programs that could breathe new life into the building. The ride back to his neighborhood felt shorter, as if the momentum of the day had propelled him forward. Earl stepped off the bus and made his way to the diner, knowing that Clara would have a fresh cup of coffee waiting. Sure enough, she greeted him with her usual warmth, setting the cup down in front of him as he slid into his usual booth. "Busy morning?" Clara asked, raising an eyebrow. Earl chuckled softly. "You could say that. Had a good talk with some folks out on the edge of town. Plenty of work to do, but it feels right." Clara nodded knowingly. "You've always been about doing what's right, Earl. That's why people trust you." Earl sipped his coffee, his thoughts already turning to the next steps. The day wasn't over yet, and there were still calls to make, plans to finalize, and dreams to bring closer to reality. For Earl, every moment mattered, because every moment was an opportunity to make a difference. Earl sat in the corner booth of Clara's diner, the hum of conversation and the faint clatter of dishes filling the air around him. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of sizzling bacon, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood. The warmth of the diner felt like a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the challenges that lay ahead. Earl stirred a spoonful of sugar into his coffee, his thoughts swirling as he mentally sorted through the tasks he'd set for himself. It wasn't just the apartment complex that demanded his attention. Earl knew that real change required more than fixing walls or replacing boilers. It required building trust, creating opportunities, and laying foundations for long-term success. That meant involving people like Sandra, Jamal, and even Marcus from the boutique. They each had a role to play, a chance to contribute to something greater than themselves. Earl's job was to ensure they saw it. As he sat there, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and Jamal walked in, his lanky frame and confident stride immediately catching Earl's attention. Jamal scanned the room, spotting Earl in the corner, and made his way over, sliding into the booth across from him. "Morning, Mr. Earl," Jamal said, his tone a mix of respect and excitement. "Clara said you might be here." Earl raised an eyebrow. "What brings you out so early? Thought you'd be sleeping in after that big pitch yesterday." Jamal grinned, shaking his head. "Nah, couldn't sleep. Too many ideas running through my head. I wanted to talk to you about the expansion plans for the community center." Earl leaned back, studying Jamal's eager expression. "Go on," he said, motioning for the young man to continue. Jamal pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, smoothing it out on the table. It was a rough sketch of the community center, with handwritten notes crammed into the margins. "I was thinking," Jamal began, "if we can secure more funding, we could add a tech lab for the kids. Give them access to computers, coding programs, stuff that'll set them up for the future. And maybe a recording studio too. There's so much talent around here, and they just need a place to express it." Earl nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the paper. "You've got good ideas, Jamal. Real good. But funding doesn't fall from the sky. How do you plan to make it happen?" Jamal hesitated, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. "I was hoping you might have some advice on that." Earl smiled faintly. "Advice I can give. But remember, this is your project. You've got to own it. First thing you need to do is find people who believe in it as much as you do. They'll help you spread the word, raise the money, and keep the momentum going." Jamal nodded, scribbling notes in the margins of his sketch. "Got it. So, who do you think I should reach out to first?" Earl took a sip of his coffee, considering the question. "Start with the people who've already shown they care. Sandra, for one. She's got connections and knows how to rally support. Then look for local businesses that might want to sponsor specific parts of the center. Folks like Clara, who've been part of this community for years." Jamal's pen moved quickly, his focus intense. "That makes sense. What about bigger organizations? Think we could get any grants or corporate sponsors?" Earl's gaze softened as he studied Jamal. "You could. But remember, those folks will want to see results. Show them what you've already done, not just what you're planning. People invest in progress, not promises." Jamal looked up, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Do you really think I can pull this off?" Earl leaned forward, his voice steady. I don't think it. I know it. But it's not about whether I believe in you, Jamal. It's about whether you believe in yourself. The weight of Earl's words seemed to settle over the young man, and after a moment he nodded, his confidence returning. I won't let you down, Mr. Earl. Earl smiled. I know you won't. They talked for a while longer, hashing out ideas and brainstorming strategies. By the time Jamal left, his energy was palpable, and Earl felt a quiet pride in the young man's determination. It was moments like this that reminded Earl why he did what he did, because every seed he planted had the potential to grow into something extraordinary. After Jamal left, Earl finished his coffee and stepped outside. The day had fully awakened now, the streets alive with activity. Earl's next stop was a meeting with Denise, his lawyer, to discuss the next phase of the redevelopment project. He flagged down a cab, the driver greeting him with a friendly nod as he climbed in. The ride was short, and soon Earl was stepping into Denise's sleek office building. The lobby was modern and minimalist, a far cry from the neighborhoods where Earl spent most of his time. He took the elevator to the top floor, where Denise's assistant greeted him warmly and led him into the conference room. Denise was already there, a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She looked up and smiled as Earl entered. Right on time, as always, she said, gesturing for him to sit. Earl settled into the chair, glancing at the papers. What's the news? Denise adjusted her glasses, her expression serious. Most of it's good. The redevelopment project is moving forward smoothly, and we've finalized the contracts for the affordable housing units. But there's been some pushback from a few stakeholders. Earl raised an eyebrow. What kind of pushback? Denise hesitated before responding. Some of the investors are questioning the profitability of the project. They're concerned about the long-term returns. Earl's expression hardened. Let them be concerned. We're not changing the plan. Denise nodded. I thought you'd say that. I've already prepared a statement to reassure them, but I wanted to run it by you first. Earl scanned the document quickly, nodding his approval. Looks good. Let them know this isn't negotiable. Denise smiled faintly. You've got a way of keeping people in line, Earl. It's impressive. It's not about keeping them in line, Earl said. It's about showing them what matters. They'll come around. The meeting continued smoothly, and by the time Earl left, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Earl had never been one to shy away from a challenge. With every step he took, he carried the weight of a city on his shoulders. But it was a weight he bore willingly, knowing that each step brought him closer to the vision he and Margaret had dreamed of. Earl stepped out of Denise's office building and onto the busy street, the mid-afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He adjusted his hat and took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air. The meeting had gone well, and his resolve was as firm as ever, but there was still a gnawing awareness of the resistance he faced. Even with the contracts signed and plans in motion, there were those who would try to slow progress, to prioritize their profits over people. He made his way to a nearby park, a quiet refuge amid the noise of the city. The paths were lined with trees just beginning to shed their leaves, and the gentle rustle of the breeze through the branches was a welcome reprieve. Earl found an empty bench and sat, his eyes scanning the park. Families picnicked on the grass, joggers passed by with headphones in their ears, and a group of children played tag near the fountain. The scene was a snapshot of life in the city, raw and unfiltered. Earl's thoughts turned to the community he had spent his life fighting for. He knew the work was never truly done. The apartment complex, the redevelopment project, the community center expansion. Each was a piece of a larger puzzle, a vision of a city that valued its people as much as its buildings. But Earl also knew that real change wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about hearts and minds, about creating spaces where dignity and opportunity thrived. His musings were interrupted by a familiar voice. Mr. Earl, I thought that was you. Earl looked up to see Sandra, the fiery-haired community leader, walking toward him. She carried a large tote bag filled with papers, her stride purposeful but her smile warm. Earl stood, tipping his hat. "Sandra, good to see you." She gestured to the bench. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," Earl said, sitting back down as Sandra took a seat beside him. "I was just coming from a meeting with the city council," she said, setting her bag down. "They finally approved the initial repairs for the old community center. It's a small step, but it's something." Earl nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Small steps are how you build big things. That center's going to be something special again, thanks to you." Sandra sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Thanks to us. You've done more than your share, Mr. Earl. I don't know how you keep going, though. Doesn't it ever get exhausting?" Earl leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Of course it does. But when you've seen what I've seen, you don't stop. You can't. Not when there's still so much that needs fixing." Sandra studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you're kind of a legend around here. People look up to you, more than you probably realize." Earl chuckled softly. "Legend, huh? I'm just a man trying to do right by the city that raised me." Sandra shook her head. "No, you're more than that. You've built something real. You've given people hope. That's not something everyone can say." Earl didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let her words settle, the weight of them both humbling and motivating. Finally, he said, "Hope's a powerful thing, but it needs action to back it up. That's what we're doing, turning hope into something people can hold on to." Sandra smiled. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Earl admitted, "but nothing worth doing ever is." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the children near the fountain as their laughter echoed through the park. Sandra eventually reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. "Speaking of turning hope into action, I've got something for you to look at. It's a proposal for a youth mentorship program we've been working on. I'd love to get your thoughts." Earl took the folder, flipping through the pages. The program was ambitious but thoughtful, focusing on providing at-risk youth with mentors, resources, and opportunities to thrive. It reminded Earl of Jamal and the potential he'd seen in the young man. "This is good work, Sandra," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Really good. You've got my support, whatever you need." Sandra's smile widened. "That means a lot, Mr. Earl. Thank you." As they continued to discuss the program, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the park in a warm golden light. By the time they wrapped up, the first hints of evening were beginning to settle in. Sandra stood, gathering her things. "I'll let you get back to your day," she said, her tone lighter now. "But don't think I won't call you when I need help." Earl chuckled. "I'd expect nothing less." After Sandra left, Earl remained on the bench for a while longer, the folder still in his hands. He thought about the future, about the programs, the projects, and the people who would carry the torch long after he was gone. There was so much left to do, but Earl wasn't daunted. He was energized, inspired by the resilience of those around him, and the belief that even the smallest actions could ripple into something far greater. As the streetlights flickered on and the park began to empty, Earl rose from the bench, slipping the folder under his arm. His pace was steady as he made his way home, his mind already turning to the plans he would set into motion tomorrow. For Earl, there was no finish line, no end to the work, only the promise of progress and the hope that each step forward would make the city a little brighter for those who called it home. The evening sky was painted in deep shades of indigo, punctuated by the faint glimmer of stars as Earl approached his home. The day's events weighed on him, but not with exhaustion, with a quiet, determined energy that urged him forward. As he stepped onto the porch, the familiar creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet felt comforting. Earl paused, taking a moment to glance at the street. The houses lining it stood still under the soft glow of the streetlights, each one holding its own stories, its own struggles and triumphs. Earl pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of his home wrapping around him. He placed the folder from Sandra on the kitchen table, knowing he'd spend the better part of the night going over her proposal. For now, though, he needed a moment to reflect. He walked to the living room, his eyes landing on the photo of Margaret and the bracelet he'd placed beside it. "Margaret," he murmured softly, his voice carrying a mix of love and resolve. "We're getting closer. Little by little, this city's becoming what we dreamed it could be." He sat in his recliner, leaning back as the quiet of the house settled around him. Earl's mind drifted to the day's moments, the conversation with Jamal, and the excitement in the young man's eyes, the cautious hope of the residents at the apartment complex, Sandra's determination as she outlined her mentorship program. These weren't just instances, they were connections, threads weaving together a greater tapestry of progress and possibility. Earl thought about Joseph Campbell's earlier call, the veiled warnings and the thinly disguised greed that drove men like him. Earl had faced men like Joseph his entire life, men who saw the city as a chessboard and its people as pawns. But Earl had learned long ago that real power wasn't about control. It was about trust, about empowering others to stand on their own and create something meaningful. As the clock ticked softly in the background, Earl reached for his notebook, flipping it open to the page marked with Margaret's handwriting. The list of dreams stared back at him, some crossed off, others waiting to be realized. He added a new item to the bottom of the list in neat, deliberate handwriting: Expand Youth Mentorship Program. He stared at the words for a moment, then closed the notebook and set it aside. His phone buzzed on the table and Earl glanced at the screen. It was Marcus, the young employee from the boutique. Earl hesitated briefly before answering, his curiosity piqued. "Good evening, Marcus," Earl said, his tone calm but warm. "Good evening, Mr. Earl," Marcus replied, his voice slightly nervous. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Earl assured him. "What's on your mind?" There was a pause before Marcus spoke again. I wanted to thank you for how you handled things at the store the other day. It made me think about a lot, about how I treat people, how I approach my work." Earl smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "That's kind of you to say, Marcus, but the real credit's yours. You saw what needed to change, and you took it to heart." "I've been reading up on some things," Marcus continued, his tone growing more confident. "About systemic issues, about ways businesses can do better. I don't want to just stand by anymore. I want to be part of the change." Earl nodded, though Marcus couldn't see him. "That's a good place to start, son. Change begins with awareness, but it's the action that follows that makes it real." Marcus sounded thoughtful. "Do you think I could maybe help with something you're working on? I want to do more than just read about change. I want to be involved." Earl's smile widened. "You've got yourself a deal, Marcus. I'll find a way to put you to work." They ended the call shortly after, and Earl felt a surge of pride for the young man's initiative. It was another reminder that progress wasn't just about what he could do. It was about what others could achieve with the right guidance and support. The house grew quieter as the evening stretched on, and Earl finally rose from his chair. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood by the window looking out at the street. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of all that lay ahead. Earl thought of Jamal, Sandra, Marcus, and all the others whose lives intertwined with his in ways big and small. Each of them carried a piece of the city's future, and Earl was determined to do everything he could to help them shape it. He finished his water, set the glass in the sink, and turned off the light, the house falling into shadow. As he made his way to his bedroom, Earl felt a profound sense of peace. The day had been long, but it had been filled with purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new victories to claim, and Earl would be ready, as he always was, to meet them head-on. Because for Earl, every day was a step closer to a city where everyone could belong, a city that he and Margaret had dreamed of together, and one he would continue building, one small step at a time. Life is full of moments where we're judged not for who we truly are, but for the surface others see, our age, appearance, or the assumptions they make. Yet, it's not those moments of judgment that define us. It's how we choose to respond. Earl's story reminds us that humility and grace can be more powerful than any display of wealth or status. Instead of lashing out, he used his influence to teach a lesson that prejudice and disrespect have no place in our world. True power doesn't come from riches or titles. It comes from character. It comes from staying grounded in your values, treating others with respect, and using what you've earned to lift up those around you. Earl's quiet triumph isn't just about putting others in their place. It's about showing that dignity, resilience, and kindness can break through even the hardest walls of ignorance. We all have a chance to leave the world a little better than we found it, whether it's through standing up for what's right, giving back to our communities, or simply offering kindness to someone who needs it. The ripple effects of those actions can change lives, just as Earl's story has changed perspectives. Let Earl's journey inspire you to lead with compassion and to build a legacy that speaks louder than words. And remember, the next time you're tempted to judge someone by what you see on the surface, think twice. You never know the battles they've fought or the heights they've reached. If stories like this move you, inspire you, or challenge you to think deeper, subscribe now to join us for more tales that remind us of the power of humanity.